Thanks for tuning into the PLR podcast, where we seek to build a network of leftists in the state of Rhode Island so that someday we can win political power. I'm Alex, and today's half episode is my reading and kind of interpretation of Mao Zedong's short article on practice. If you like what you hear, please follow us on Instagram, reach out to us, recommend us things to read. Recommend half episodes. It's all good. We're in the works right now of putting together a Patreon because the work of reading, interpreting these articles, whether for the half episodes or for the full episodes, it takes some time, as does the technological aspects of podcasting, having guests on, Zoom memberships for interviews, and all this other stuff. We also try to accommodate guests if they come to the studio, to the Turtle Show. We try to accommodate them by either offering to pay for their COVID test or driving them here, making sure that they have drinks or snacks that they like to make them comfortable talking to three strangers. So there's a lot of logistics that goes into this podcast that we're hoping if you're willing as a listener, you'd be able to contribute $1 per month to help. And then any money that's left over after the logistical costs, we're going to donate to the organizations that come on the show. So the money goes right back into the community that it's serving. We all have our own jobs. We all have our own incomes. And so we're not trying to ask for any more than $1 per month. In this episode, I am going over Mao Zedong's short article called On Practice, which came out in 1937. But before I dive into it, I wanted to, per usual, provide some historical context to this. The article came out in 1937, which is just a few years after Zedong's forces entered Yunnan province in what was then China, that was both being colonized by Japan and also being ruled supposedly by the Kuomintang, that is Chiang Kai-shek's forces. What made the Chinese Communist Party different than these two opposition forces, other than core ideology, is that Zedong knew that it was useful for the Chinese communists to work directly with the peasantry, by either helping them farm or teaching them how to read. His idea was that illiterate peasantry could be helpful in the coming revolutionary struggle and could be helpful in helping the Chinese forces in general fight off the Japanese imperialists. So the effort to educate the peasantry was a move that ultimately made Zedong successful because the opportunity to seize power came. When it came, the Communist Party had the support of the peasants. Unlike the Kuomintang, who were requisitioning supplies and food from the peasantry to fight the Japanese, and unlike the Japanese, who were also requisitioning supplies. But in 1935, Mao made a break from his feud with the Kuomintang, and he realized that the only way to beat the Japanese, to expel them from Manchuria, was through an alliance, a military alliance with Chiang Kai-shek. So this essay on practice comes at a time when Zedong was living in a glorified cave in the provinces and reflecting on how the Chinese Communist Party would seize power. His reflections on practical knowledge are in this essay, therefore, make a lot of sense to us in that historical context. We see here that Mao is engaging with practical reality of China, the reality of Japanese imperialism, and he is ready to sacrifice some of the ideological dogmatism in order to move forward, recognizing practical reality, what exists subjectively in front of you, and knowing that you have to engage with this in order to move forward. Only then would the Chinese Communist Party be able to win political power. And the article starts off with a short explanation of scientific Marxism, which Zedong says developed thanks to modern production. And so, according to his theory, scientific Marxism, not to be confused with utopian Marxism, is something that we can objectively find and discover and analyze in our everyday world. And to do that, you need a historical understanding of the proletariat and its historical role. If the Marxist trajectory of history is eventually the point of communism, then you need to recognize that scientific Marxism finds a specific role for the proletariat in reaching that historical destiny. And therefore, man's ideas must correspond with the laws of the objective external world. But then you might ask, Mao Zedong, uh, but then what? What is the criteria for an objective reality? How do you know uh, that what you're seeing is objectively true? And he says, the truth of any knowledge or theory is determined not by subjective feelings, but by objective results in social practice. And I think that the adjective here, social, is key to understanding this. It's social practice, not political practice, not anything else, but social practice. Only social practice can be the criterion of truth. The standpoint of practice is the primary and basic standpoint in the dialectical materialist theory of knowledge. So, again, how does practice serve human knowledge? You might be asking. And this is the core of this entire essay on practice. Again, how does practice serve human knowledge? And Zedong lays out two stages of cognition that we can imagine dialectically. If you look at the episode image that I provided for this episode, you'll see what I mean by imagining this dialectically. The first stage he calls perceptual stage of impressions, but there's no logical conclusions. And so these are sort of the sensory perceptions that you see in the everyday world, but you can't draw any logical conclusions from this. The second stage he calls judgments and inferences, which coupled with those sensory perceptions, you can start to draw conclusions. And these two stages, the perceptual and the judgment, find unity in practice, leading to the sort of synthesis of rational knowledge. Zedong writes, Marxism-Leninism holds that each of the two stages in the process of cognition has its own characteristics, with knowledge manifesting itself as perceptual at the lower stage and logical at the higher stage, but that both are stages in an integrated process of cognition. So again, this is a dialectical relationship, so the two sides are equal to each other. They're equal in the sense that they only together lead to the same synthesis, the same rational knowledge. The perceptual and the rational are qualitatively different, but are not divorced from each other. They are unified on the basis of practice. Our practice proves that what is perceived can at once be comprehended, and that only what is comprehended can be more deeply perceived. Perception only solves the problem of phenomena. Theory alone can solve the problem of essence. The solving of both these problems is not separate in the slightest degree from practice. Whoever wants to know a thing has no way of doing so except by coming into contact with it. That is by living, aka practicing, in its environment. So again, think about what the Chinese Communist Party was doing at this time and going out, helping the peasantry to farm, teaching them how to read. They were engaging directly in the practice of the Chinese peasantry to try to understand them more, to try to recruit them into the socialist fold, which is a project that the Soviet Union never really got right. The peasantry in Russia will become, or especially in Ukraine, will become the hardest people to win over for the new Soviet state, but not so in China, where Mao's Zedong's theory here is literally to insert yourself into the life of the peasantry as a form of practice to get to know them, to add that rational knowledge. And here Zedong gives the example of imperialism, the example of the Chinese people's knowledge of imperialism, at least. He writes, similarly, with the Chinese people's knowledge of imperialism, the first stage was one of superficial perceptual knowledge, as shown in the indiscriminate anti-foreign struggles of the movement of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, the Yao Ho Tuan movement, and so on. So these early movements against British or European imperialism in China manifest themselves in anti-foreign struggles to expel these people. But Zedong is saying that there's something more to that. He goes on, it was only in the second stage that the Chinese people reached the stage of rational knowledge, saw the internal and external contradictions of imperialism, and saw the essential truth that imperialism had allied itself with China's compror and federal classes to oppress and exploit the great masses of the Chinese people. This knowledge began about the time of the May 4th movement in 1919. So any good Marxist would understand that what Mao is describing here is the coming of social consciousness of the Chinese people against the imperialist forces, a kind of class solidarity or class consciousness. But these two dialectic motions are in constant relation with each other. Again, the perceptual and the judgmental, according to Zedong. One is not more or less important, but only together can they guide action. And this, according to Zedong, is why theory becomes so important, and also why the importance of theory is easy to lose sight of. Zedong writes, as against this, vulgar, quote, practical men, end quote, respect experience but despise theory, and therefore cannot have a comprehensive view of an entire objective process. They lack clear direction and long-range perspective, and are complacent over occasional successes and glimpses of the truth. If such persons direct a revolution, they will lead it up a blind alley. So I'm a real big fan of this because I am a historian, and so what Zedong is saying here is that theoretical knowledge based on practice, both present and past, will help a revolutionary movement avoid mistakes of the past. Theory should be something that you learn from and that you model your practice over. When the two dialectic categories synthesize to rational knowledge, according to Zedong again, it must give way to revolutionary practice. So that revolutionary practice is the combination of experience and judgment. And a better way to say that is revolutionary practice is a combination of lived experience of practice itself and judgment, that is theory, an understanding of that practice. You cannot have practice alone because revolutionary movements need progress, and they can't progress without a theoretical understanding of what has been and what might be based on that experience, if that makes much sense. To sort of simplify that, if you're looking to further your social democratic movement, you wouldn't get very far if you didn't base your actions on the actions of the past. And you wouldn't have an understanding of how the actions of the past failed unless you had some notion of theory, of some system of understanding how those past movements failed. And even just recognizing that there were social democratic movements in the past is something that I think a lot of leftists today lose sight of. I mean, what we're going through today, even with the DSA or whatever leftist organization that you're a part of, Antifa even, they're not new. The conditions of our current social predicament are new. The United States is new. What people call late capitalism is roughly new, but these socialist movements have existed before, and not only in Zedong's China, but also in Germany in the early 20th century, even in the 1960s, as we all know. And we have a lot to learn from those movements, their practice, their failures, and their successes. Marxism emphasizes the importance of theory precisely and only because it can guide action. If we have a correct theory but merely parade it about and pigeonhole it and don't put it into practice, then that theory, no matter how good it is of no significance. So again, to understand these things dialectically means to understand them in constant relationship to each other, constantly bouncing off of each other. They don't exist in isolation. So this is Zedong's theory on practice. That however important it is, it's important to keep in mind that it's just as important as theory is. And I feel like there's a lot of leftist organizations or leftist people today who dismiss theory because it's understandably a difficult thing to grasp. But in that case, your action shouldn't be to dismiss it or to deny its importance, but to ask more questions about it so that you can better understand it. If your realm of revolutionary practice is in action, if it's in practice, then you should give theory its due, but also, maybe keep your attention in practice, because we need both the theoreticians and the people of action to have a successful revolutionary moment. That's all I have for you today. It was a short article. If you are interested in it and you want to read more, you can easily find it online. I think in the future half episodes, I have some big theoretical readings coming up. Not only Lenin at some point, which I'm very excited to do because I am technically a scholar of the Soviet Union, but also Karl Kautsky, who is not talked about that much by revolutionary circles, probably for good reason, or maybe not for good reason. You might have something to take away from him. I may do more Rosa Luxemburg at some time, and always looking for more people to read and talk about with you. Again, keep an eye out for our Patreon page that should be coming out, and thank you for listening as always.